and welcome to the April edition of the Lit Gals. I'm Martie Hoofer, Digital Content Manager for Keep Indiana Learning, and we are excited to be with you today. Here as the school year is getting ready to wrap up, but we are here in National Poetry Month. So, Anna, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about those early poetry memories?
Oh my goodness. So what a lovely day, huh? Just a lovely April day. We can be so happy that the sun is shining. And it does kind of remind us of some beautiful poems that we've had before. Hi, I'm Anna Cook. I'm a professional literacy specialist and just so happy to be here with you, Martie. And every month it's always something new and different.
Yeah.
So, poems are not my favorite to teach.
Funny, not mine either. And you and I did not talk about this before.
No, we haven't. But really, it was not my most favorite thing to teach.
No.
But it was one of my favorites to hear and to read, only because I think that one of the first forms of poetry, if you will, nursery rhymes. My mom read a lot of nursery rhymes, and I got to know through nursery rhymes and my mom reading them of that poetry, if you will. And so I think that when I was a first grade teacher, those early poems, I modeled what my mother did as well. And if you think about it, in first grade, it's usually some rhyming poems, etc. And then, but going back to when I was learning rhymes and nursery rhymes, etc., I really got kind of knocked into reality when I became a seventh grader. And they were talking, my teacher was talking about poems, and they don't need to rhyme. And I think that was the biggest, oh my gosh, what do you mean? They don't need to rhyme? Yeah. Because once again, that's all that I had ever heard.
Yeah.
And so you were a middle school teacher.
Yes. And actually my first poetry memories, yes, nursery rhymes, I certainly knew them, but like when I think of poetry and what is the first memory that if you ask me about poetry and my schooling, not as a teacher, but as a student, I go back to seventh grade. So funny that that's where your moment is also. So when I was in seventh grade, I sat in Mr. Stephen Meyer's seventh grade class. And I have a lot of memories about Mr. Stephen Meyer, most of them quite fond. But the two things that really, really stand out to me is the two poems we had to memorize, and we had to stand in front of the class and recite these poems. And my friend, they were not short poems. One of them was If by Rudyard Kipling. Which, it's just beautiful. It's so rich. I did not appreciate it as a seventh grader.
And do you still remember some of it?
Okay, not so much of that one. But that is the other, and I don't remember which order we did them in. But if like somebody starts a stanza of If, I can often pick it up and run with it.
Okay.
The one I do remember quite well is we had to memorize all 5 verses of the Star Spangled Banner.
Oh, wow.
So, which was written as a poem. It wasn't written as a song. It's written as a poem by Francis Scott Key during the War of 1812. So I often taught the Star Spangled Banner to my seventh graders. I didn't make them stand and recite it. That would have been a revolt waiting to happen. But I did teach it as a poem because that's the way it was originally written. So okay, I've never told anyone this, so I'll just tell the entire internet at once. When I stand and, we're at a ball game or whatever, and the Star Spangled Banner is played, the verse that's running through my head is the 5th verse because it's my favorite. And so while the rest of the crowd is singing the first verse that everyone knows, the words in Martie's head are
the fifth.
Because it's my favorite.
Wow.
Yeah, I think lots of people don't even know that there are 5 stanzas to the Star Spangled
Banner. No, I would not have known that. Wow, that is pretty cool. I didn't know that it was written as a poem.
Written as a poem, actually on a warship in the harbor in Baltimore, as Francis Scott Key watched. I can't think of the name of the fort. It was being bombarded by the British as part of the War of 1812, and he can see the flag waving over the fort, and it inspired him to write while he's sitting on a ship. But so those 2 songs, well, both poems, we just know one is a song. There is some rhyme in If, but there's very little rhyme in the Star Spangled Banner. So like you said, I think that's a common misconception about poetry is it doesn't have to rhyme. It can, but it doesn't have to. And so, yeah, what are your thoughts? Or what are other misconceptions?
So then I become a 4th and 5th grade teacher, and this kind of circles back around to my first comment of I really didn't like to teach it because we didn't have to teach the rhyming poem. Most of the time it was different types of poetry. And it made me stretch, which was a good thing. But boy, for me, it was hard to teach.
Yeah.
And I don't know why. I don't know. Do you think that because it doesn't rhyme, it is of a higher level? It's more of a depth of knowledge 3 or 4 or something like that makes people really have to think deeply?
And I think so. And I think as students write poetry, it forces them to not just take the easy word that rhymes and not use their rhyme to force what they're trying to say, but to truly say what it is they need to say. But yeah, I'm with you. I did not enjoy teaching poetry as a writing teacher or a reading teacher at first, but then, man, I grew to love it because I felt like, especially in writing poetry, and I tended to teach them together. I would, even in writing class, we would read poems because, I mean, how else would we know how to write them without reading them?
I mean, it's fabulous mentor text.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so I would, share with them a different style of poetry, and then we would try to write it. But so then when I would turn them loose to write, I always had this rule in my classroom. At the end of any poetry writing day, you did not have to share, but you were always welcome to share. And if you didn't want to read your poem, I would read it for you, because sometimes there's something about that reading your own work that feels even more vulnerable. But I'll tell you what, I learned things about students, and I heard some of their most vulnerable moments through shared poetry. And I mean, like, I think of this little boy. I cannot think of his name, but he sat up in the front of the classroom. I could tell you where I was standing. He volunteered to read his poem. I'm like, hey, that's great. You don't often volunteer to share. And so he volunteers to share. Anna, when he finished, you could have heard a pin drop in that room because he wrote about his brother's murder.
Oh my goodness gracious.
And I'm like, to my knowledge, he had never shared that with anyone in that room. And that's what he wrote about, and that's what he shared. And I'm like, my respect for poetry went to a whole new level because of what it allowed him to share and process.
He could do that.
Yeah.
And it really, we all hear about how just writing is very, therapeutic, and we should all just write. And for him to write then a poem, wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty wonderful.
Yeah. I was like, oh my.
You did good work there, Mrs. Hoofer.
All I did was present the opportunity. I'm thankful he took it.
He felt free, and he felt safe.
Yeah.
He felt like it was a safe place.
Yeah. And so, like I said, my respect, and I never again doubted why I taught poetry.
Yeah.
Never again.
That's pretty
Never
cool.
Again. Yeah. So speaking of, shared moments, we today are going to share some of our favorite poems, and my favorite poet is Langston Hughes.
Oh, I love that book. I've got that book.
Okay.
I love it.
Yeah. So this is a whole series of books. If our viewers aren't aware, they are called Poetry for Young People. This one happens to be filled with Langston Hughes poems. And they're just, I don't know if it says in here, or like, here's some of the list. Oh, Rudyard Kipling, since I just mentioned him, he's on the list. Robert Frost, Emily Dickinson, Lewis Carroll. There's poets on here I have never heard of. To Shakespeare is listed. Edgar Allan Poe, we've talked about him before. So these are just beautiful books. The art in them is absolutely stunning. But
Love
then they're just poems by whoever the poet is. So I marked two that were my favorite, and I'm going to make a call. I'll just share my other poem. My other favorite Langston Hughes is called Harlem, and it's about a dream deferred. I love that one. But the one I'm going to read is called Mother to Son.
Oh, wonderful for Mother's Day.
And there's the
look at that.
Isn't that beautiful?
It is.
So here we go. Well, son, I'll tell you, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It's had tacks in it and splinters and boards torn up and places with no carpet on the floor, bare. But all the time I's been a climbing on and reaching landings and turning corners and sometimes going in the dark where there ain't been no light. So boy, don't you turn back. Don't you set down on the steps 'cause you find it's kind of hard. Don't you fall now, for I's still going, honey. I's still climbing, and life for me ain't been no crystal stair. I love it.
That's wonderful.
I love it.
Yeah.
So
that's a good one. That's wonderful.
And my other one, I'm not going to read the whole poem, but my favorite poem, unless we're talking Langston Hughes, is Casey at the Bat. And Casey at the Bat is a narrative poem. So it means it tells a story. And Casey at the Bat is written by Ernest Lawrence Thayer. And this is just a beautiful copy of the poem. You can find it in many, many books. But I love this copy in particular because it looks like an old newspaper. And so it tells, there's the headline.
Oh my gosh, look at that.
Casey at the Bat.
Oh, that's cool.
So, just these old timey pencil drawings that are just beautiful.
Oh, I've never seen that before, Martie.
I picked it up at like a half price books some years and years ago.
Wow.
I already owned multiple copies of Casey at the Bat, but when I saw this one, I'm like, and I need that one too. So then I never picked up my other copies again this was always my example of narrative poetry for my students.
So you've got various books of that poem.
I do.
I love that.
Sure do. That's how much I love it. I just love this poem. So those are
that
my
could be a unit on its own.
It could be. You could do all kinds of things with Casey at the Bat, including talk about different kinds of writing. They could actually write it as a newspaper article. So you could teach journalism. There's all kinds of you could do some fun stop action photography using your device to illustrate the poem. How fun would that be?
So here I am writing in high school.
Exactly. That's a middle school thing, but it would be so fun. So those are my favorite poet, Langston Hughes, and my favorite poem, Casey at the Bat. So Anna, I'm so excited about what you have to share with us today.
Well, okay. So you were talking about when you were in 7th grade and the two. Mine was the Robert Frost one, Dreams, Hold Fast to Dreams. If dreams die, you know, I can go on. And I think I've done that one with the Lit Gals. Yeah. But this time I wanted to read a poem from the Easter Bunny. So every single year since my daughter was about 4 years old, the Easter Bunny sends her a poem to look for her Easter basket. And
Oh.
now she's 29 years old and has 3 boys of her own and also is married and everything. The Easter Bunny still comes out to send a poem.
Love
And
it.
this is the one that he sent this year.
Well, aren't we honored to have the Easter Bunny share his work on the Lit Gals?
Yep. And some things just don't change since, Anna was a little girl and Anna, So this is a rhyming poem. Don't be stunned. From the Easter Bunny. It's Easter time. It's Easter time and an opportunity for me to write a rhyme. You've added another sweet addition to your family that, by my admission, now includes 3 sweet boys who give their Oma so much joy. However, let's get started on the search that will definitely send you into a lurch. Your basket is hidden where there's trash, not the kind that will bring any cash, but the type that is shown by when it was really blowin'. So start looking right now, and when you find it, give yourself a bow. Happy Easter, the Easter Bunny. So if you remember, right before Easter, it was those high winds.
Yes.
That blew a lot of trash.
Yeah. Look at that Easter Bunny paying attention to the weather.
Every year he comes up with a different one. Every year.
Who knew he was so smart? I had no idea.
Rhyming. Go figure.
So I don't know, maybe the Easter Bunny, maybe you don't know this about the Easter Bunny, but so all 25 of his poems have rhymed?
All 25.
All 25.
All 25. And all 25 is something with a little bit of a different spin depending upon what's going on in Alexandra's life.
I love that. A very smart and tuned in Easter Bunny poet.
Sort of like an elf on a shelf. He knows what's going on.
There we go. Yes, exactly. All right. Well, let's wrap up with, what are you reading or listening to? Anna, you always have the most fascinating ansers for this. I have a book. You just never know what it's going to be. Anything.
Remember when, I think it was you or April that said, are you listening to it or are you actually reading it? Okay. So I'm working in lots of schools, and I have, we've really hyper-focused on guided reading, and I have been doing a lot of modeling. This is not even half of what Anna's been reading, and Anna has been modeling and during guided reading time. So riveting. Perhaps not as riveting as yours, Martie, but yeah, Anna has done a lot of reading this past month with a lot of different levels, and it's just been all good and very insightful.
So let me ask you a question. We'll kind of go down a teaching strategy question here for a second. Even those short guided reading books, do you read those in advance of the kiddos?
You mean before I teach it? Oh, yes. Oh, my goodness gracious. So the biggest aha for all of us, and I mean, I've known this for years, but, if you don't read this before and you really have, I mean, you've got to tune into what your students are needing at that time. Just picking up a level E or a level F book or whatever is not, because all the levels are slightly, or the publishers have slightly different nuances in their levels. So one J book is not like another J book. A lot of times, and they may not have the focus that you are working on. So you have got to read beforehand and make sure that your focus is being addressed.
Yeah, that's what I figured the answer would be, but I had to ask, having never taught elementary school, because I can see people thinking about misconceptions that, oh, okay, I'm a teacher, I'll just go over and pick up the J book and here we go. That's what I figured the answer would be, but I wanted to see if my suspicions were right.
Yes, and that's the reason that, we laugh when we say Anna's been reading a lot of guided reading books, but it is a lot.
Yeah.
And I really have to, like I said, really make sure that my focus that I want to work with my students is being met.
Yeah, makes sense. All right. Well, my book that I'm reading right now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it. We think we're going to save that maybe for next month's show. But I am reading Lois Lowry's latest book called The Winderby Puzzle. Now, Lois Lowry is best known probably for The Giver #1. That's not my favorite of hers. I'm a huge fan of Number the Stars. My favorite is probably Gossamer, which is one I don't think is not nearly as well known as Number the Stars or The Giver. But when I heard she had a new book, I was like, excuse me? And so I go, yes, it came out in February.
I can't believe that.
Brand new.
Yeah.
And like I said, not going to go into details, but I am thoroughly enjoying it. It's classic Lois Lowry in that it's just quality writing, great storytelling. The quote on the back, there is a saying that when people die, they continue to live as long as someone remembers them. I would add, and tells their story. And she is writing that as Lois Lowry, as the author of the book.
Right.
So she's telling a very particular person's story.
Please bring that back.
I will.
I mean that.
Yeah.
I want to know exactly. Yes. I think our listeners will too.
Yeah. I'm not even quite halfway through it. So I'm not sure where it's going, but I can tell you I'm loving it. And it's set in the 1st century. So it's not exactly a book that I'd be like, ooh, that's my favorite time period.
Right.
Pretty sure I've never read a book set in the 1st century. So, yeah, there you go. There's what I read.
Yes.
Yeah.
Bring it back.
I will bring this one back. Well, that wraps up our April show. We have lots of exciting stuff planned for May. So watch Twitter as we may leak some hints there, but we will see you back next month for our final show of this school year. So
final one.
Crazy. Thank you for joining us and happy reading.
Thank you.
And have a great afternoon.
Thank you.